My name's Noah. I'm 27 now, but this story starts a few years ago at my grandmother's funeral. Or rather, it starts long before that. But the funeral, that's when the mask came off, when all the quiet whispers, sideways glances, and passive-aggressive smiles finally turned into something loud, ugly, and impossible to ignore. That day didn't mark the beginning of the betrayal, but it absolutely was when the betrayal stood up, adjusted its tie, and decided it didn't care who was watching. Growing up, I always felt like the background character in my own family. My mom, Teresa, had two younger brothers, my uncles Mark and Dean, and together, the three of them formed this little triangle of self-importance that seemed to suck all the air out of every room. I was the quiet kid, the one who stayed out of arguments, the one who didn't speak unless spoken to, and who got good grades but didn't brag about them. My cousins were louder, sportier, more presentable at family dinners. They played into the family pecking order, learning early how to flatter my mom and uncles, echo their opinions, laugh at their jokes. I didn't. I just observed, which, as I'd later learn, made them nervous. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandmother, Evelyn. I called her Nana, even after the others had grown out of it. She had this way of speaking, soft, slow, like every word was meant to matter, and whenever I was around her, I never felt like I had to fight for space. She made room. While my mom scolded me for being too sensitive or too quiet to be taken seriously, Nana would pull me aside and say things like, "Listening is a lost art, Noah. You're going to understand people in a way they never understand you. And that's a gift." I lived for those moments. Every summer, I'd spend 2 weeks at her house upstate, a modest little place with creaky floors, hydrangeas by the window, and a tin of butterscotch candies that never emptied. There was no Wi-Fi, no cable, but I never minded. We'd sit on the porch and just talk. Or rather, she'd talk, and I'd listen. And in return, she listened to me. The rest of the family didn't really get it. My mom liked to complain that Evelyn always babied Noah, and Mark once joked, half laughing, half bitter, that Nana must have thought I was some kind of prophet the way she hung on my every word. I never responded. But inside, I knew why they were like that. Nana didn't shower them with attention the same way. She didn't fake interest in Mark's third failed startup or Dean's third wife. She didn't compliment Mom's new kitchen Reno or like every photo she posted of her dog wearing sunglasses. Nana didn't care about those things. She cared about people, real people, and that made them furious. When she got sick, it was sudden, a stroke, followed by a rapid decline that none of us were prepared for. Well, some of us weren't. My mom and uncles treated it like an inconvenience, something that disrupted their busy lives. Dean flew in once, Mark called twice, and my mom, well, she was too wrapped up in her HOA feud to make more than a single hospital visit. I, on the other hand, spent every weekend there, sitting beside Nana's bed, reading her the letters she used to write but never sent. She'd penned dozens over the years, little observations, memories, even secrets. She gave them to me in a worn leather box one day, said, "One day, when I'm not here, you'll know what to do with these." I didn't understand at the time, but I nodded, because that's what I always did. Then she was gone. The funeral was a blur, at first. It was held at St. Catherine's, a small church that smelled like old hymn books and polished wood. I showed up early, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to my college graduation, and stood quietly near the back while people filtered in. My mom arrived with a dramatic sigh and a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mark trailed behind her, muttering something about parking, and Dean made a beeline for the front pew like it was his name engraved on the marble. I stayed where I was, out of the way, watching. That's when I heard it. "Let's keep him away from the front." He was never really close to her, my mom said, loud enough that heads turned. Her voice had that sharp, performative tone she used when she wanted people to hear something without having to say it twice. My Uncle Mark nodded, smirking like they were in on some private joke. "He's just here for the inheritance," he added casually, like I was some vulture circling the casket. The words hit harder than I expected, not because I believed them, but because they did. I could feel my face flush, heat rising to my ears. But I didn't say anything. I just lowered my head and stayed in the back, pretending I didn't hear. It wasn't the first time they'd dismissed me, but somehow, in that moment, it stung more than usual. Maybe because it was Nana's day. Maybe because she wasn't there to defend me anymore. Or maybe because, deep down, I had a feeling something bigger was coming. The service went on. Hushed prayers, distant sobs, and a slideshow of grainy photos set to some generic instrumental track. And then the priest stepped forward, holding a sealed white envelope. "There is one final message," he said, voice solemn. "A letter Mrs. Evelyn Martin left behind." Whispers buzzed through the pews. My mother adjusted her sunglasses. Dean leaned forward slightly, already eager for the drama. The priest cleared his throat. "She asked that this letter be read aloud by Noah." Suddenly, it was quiet. Dead quiet. I could feel their eyes on me, confused, annoyed, maybe even a little panicked. I stood slowly, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I walked down the aisle, past cousins and neighbors, and people I barely knew. I could see my mom's expression twist from confusion to disbelief to something colder, something calculating. Mark's mouth was slightly open, and Dean's jaw was clenched. I stepped up to the podium, took the envelope from the priest with trembling fingers, and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, and something else, something small and metallic that clinked softly against the paper. My throat tightened. I unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest Noah." I didn't get further before I saw the shift. My mom's eyes narrowed. Dean leaned forward. Mark sat up straighter. Because there, nestled in the envelope, was a small brass key and Nana's ring. And just like that, the funeral changed. The air turned heavier, the tension thicker. Everyone froze. Because they knew, whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be for them. I stood there at the podium, my fingers trembling slightly as I held the letter. I could feel every single set of eyes glued to me, the heat of their judgment pressing into my back. And yet, as I unfolded Nana's note and read those first 4 words, "My dearest Noah," a strange calm settled over me. It was like her voice was guiding me through the chaos. She'd written in her usual looping script, slightly shaky from age, but still unmistakably hers. I read it aloud, slowly, letting each word land. "My dearest Noah, if this letter is being read, it means I've already said my goodbyes in this world. But you, my sweet boy, you were the only one who ever truly listened. You never asked for anything, and yet you gave me everything I ever wanted in my last years: peace, warmth, and the comfort of being understood. I know there will be whispers today, perhaps worse, but I need you to remember something. What I'm leaving to you, I leave not because of obligation or bloodline, but because you earned it. There's a key enclosed. You know the house. The ring is yours as well. It belonged to my grandmother, and now, I want it to stay with someone who treasures family for the right reasons. Don't let the noise get to you. Keep listening. Keep being who you are. And when the time is right, speak louder than all of them. With all my love, Nana." Silence. I didn't dare look up right away. My voice had held steady, but my chest was tight. I carefully folded the letter back up, slipped it into my jacket pocket along with the key and the ring, and stepped down. Still not looking at them. Still just listening. Behind me, a murmur spread. My mother was the first to break it. "That must be a mistake," she hissed under her breath, but loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "She probably meant someone else." Dean let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, she wasn't exactly thinking straight in her final days." Mark leaned toward my mother. "We need to talk after this." I took my seat again, but it didn't feel like sitting, it felt like waiting. Something was coming, and I could feel, in my gut, it was going to get much worse before it got better. In the days that followed, my phone was a battlefield. Voicemails, texts, missed calls, some from cousins pretending to check in on how I was doing, thinly veiled attempts to figure out exactly what Nana had left me. Others weren't even subtle. My mother called me the morning after the funeral, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Don't get too comfortable." I blinked. "Excuse me." She sighed dramatically. "I just mean, whatever you think she left you, we need to go over it. You can't just walk away with things that are supposed to be shared." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice even. "She left me a letter. A key. A ring. That's it." She scoffed. "That's not just anything. That house is part of the family estate. It was hers," I interrupted. "And she gave it to me." There was a pause. Then a low, measured voice I didn't quite recognize in her. "Noah, I've tolerated your quiet little attitude for a long time. But if you think you're going to rob this family blind while hiding behind a dead woman's letter..." I hung up. It was the first time in my life I'd ever done that to her. It felt both terrifying and necessary. I drove up to Nana's house the following weekend. I hadn't been there since before the hospital visits, and stepping onto the porch again felt like returning to a place where time didn't move forward the same way. Everything was still there. The rocking chair, the chipped ceramic gnome in the garden, even the faint smell of lavender from the potted plants she always kept near the window. I unlocked the door with the brass key, stepped inside, and for the first time since her passing, felt safe. I spent that night sorting through her things, not out of greed, despite what my family might have assumed, but out of memory. Every photo frame was a snapshot of another summer, another inside joke. There were letters she'd written to herself, to friends who'd passed before her, to people who never answered. And there were more letters to me, unsent, but sealed. You always looked like you were trying to shrink into yourself, Noah. Like you were afraid to take up space. I hope this house reminds you that you belong. I sat on the old couch, Nana's ring clenched in my fist, and cried for the first time in weeks. But peace doesn't last long in my family. 2 days later, I got a call from a lawyer. Apparently, there was a reading of Nana's will scheduled that week, and I hadn't been informed. Not by accident. My mom had assumed I wouldn't care. I showed up anyway. It was held in a bland office building downtown. Beige walls, leather chairs, and a conference table so polished it reflected the fluorescent lights. My mother, Mark, and Dean were already there, dressed in muted shades of entitlement. They didn't look surprised to see me. They looked annoyed. The lawyer, a man named Raymond, cleared his throat and began. He read the usual formalities first, some modest bank accounts, sentimental heirlooms, small donations to charity. Then he paused. There is one item that seems to be causing some confusion, he said, eyes flicking to me. The house at 214, Brook Hollow Drive. Dean leaned forward. Yes, that should go to the 3 children, correct? Raymond shook his head. No. Mrs. Evelyn Martin signed a transfer of ownership 6 months prior to her passing. The property is no longer part of the estate. It belongs solely to Mr. Noah Martin. Mark's mouth dropped open. No, that can't be right. My mom's voice turned sharp. She must have been manipulated. She wasn't in her right mind. Raymond didn't flinch. We have psychiatric evaluations from 3 independent professionals. All confirmed her full capacity at the time of the signing. Dean scoffed. She was old. Old people get confused. Raymond's voice turned cold. She was not confused. She was deliberate. That's when the storm really hit. My mother stood up. You are not keeping that house, Noah. That is family property. It was supposed to be divided. I stood too, finally looking her in the eye. She didn't see it that way. She gave it to me. Her lips curled. You manipulated her. I stared at her, stunned. Are you serious? She was vulnerable. You took advantage. You isolated her. Mark chimed in. You don't even do anything, Noah. You just sit around and pretend to care. It's creepy, honestly. Dean pointed a finger. This is theft. You hear me? You stole from this family. And then my mom leaned forward, eyes locked onto mine. You don't deserve anything she gave you. You weren't even around growing up. You were just the quiet, awkward kid no one wanted to deal with. She gave you attention because she felt pity. That was the breaking point. The room blurred for a second. Not from tears, just from sheer, white-hot pressure building behind my eyes. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. And something else too. A realization. They weren't just grieving badly. They weren't just lashing out. They genuinely believed I didn't matter. That I was a footnote in the family narrative. Someone who was tolerated, not loved. Someone who was allowed to exist only so long as I didn't take up too much space. But Nana had rewritten that story, and they couldn't stand it. I turned to the lawyer. Can I see the paperwork? He nodded and handed me a folder. Inside was a notarized deed, signed in Nana's careful handwriting. It was real. It was mine. I looked back at them. She made her choice. I'm not apologizing for being loved. Dean laughed bitterly. You think this is over? Mark muttered. You'll hear from our lawyer. But Mom just stared at me. That same tight-lipped glare she used to give me as a kid when I didn't fold my clothes the right way or answered a question with too much hesitation. She didn't say anything, because she knew she'd lost, or at least she thought she had. I wish that was the end of it, that they'd just fume and vanish and I could move into Nana's house in peace. But people like them don't give up. And their next move? It was so cruel, so calculated, that it made everything up until that point look like child's play. And it nearly destroyed everything Nana had tried to protect. I didn't go back to the house right away after the will reading. I needed to clear my head. I ended up driving to a coffee shop I used to visit in college. One of those small, quiet places where they write your name on the cup in real cursive, not bubble letters. I ordered black coffee, sat in the corner, and tried to breathe. The lawyer's words kept playing in my mind. She was deliberate. I needed that, because the rest of the day had been anything but calm. I could still hear my mother's voice echoing, calling me a manipulator, an opportunist, saying Nana pitted me. Part of me wanted to believe it didn't matter, that the truth was obvious, and that the house, her house, was proof of it. But sitting there in that coffee shop, staring out the rain-streaked window, I realized something else. I'd spent so much of my life trying to not be a burden, trying to avoid conflict, be the quiet one, the good son, the respectful nephew, never asking for much, never fighting back. And somehow, that had turned into a weapon they used against me. My silence became weakness in their eyes. My kindness, manipulation. My grief, greed. And the worst part? A small voice in me had started to believe them. The fall didn't come all at once. It came in waves. It started with the calls. My mother left a message every other day, always some mix of passive-aggressive concern and legal threats. I hope you're taking care of that place, Noah. She loved her garden, remember? Or, Dean spoke to someone about contesting that transfer. This isn't over. Mark wasn't much better. He sent texts dripping in sarcasm. Hey, new landlord. Heard the old house creaks. Hope it doesn't collapse under all that moral superiority. And then came the real blow. 3 weeks after the will reading, I got a letter in the mail. Official looking. Thick envelope. It was a notice of legal action. My uncles and mother were suing to contest the property transfer, citing undue influence and emotional manipulation. Their argument was thin, but they had resources, lawyers, money, and the worst part? They were using Nana's declining health as the foundation. The same people who hadn't visited her more than once in the hospital were now painting her as mentally vulnerable to get the house back. That broke something in me. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped eating right. I stopped returning texts from friends. Even my job started to suffer. I was a freelance editor at the time, mostly remote work, but even that felt impossible. I'd sit in front of the screen and just stare. I didn't even realize how bad things had gotten until I visited the house again and found one of the flower beds, Nana's favorite one, with the hydrangeas, completely dead. I'd forgotten to water them. I sat down on the front step, the sun setting behind me, and felt so small, like a child again. Useless, powerless, exactly what they always believed I was. That was my lowest point. The lawsuit dragged on. I drained my savings just trying to keep up with the paperwork. The lawyer Nana had used, Raymond, was doing what he could, but even he warned me. They're trying to bleed you dry, Noah. It's not about winning. It's about exhausting you until you give in. And honestly, I almost did. But then, something shifted. It started small. I found one of Nana's journals tucked in a drawer behind some old coasters. Not the usual thoughtful entries or recipes. This one was raw, personal. She'd written about her frustrations with the family, their selfishness, their entitlement. And then she wrote about me. Noah sees the world differently. He doesn't perform for anyone. He feels. They think he's weak because he doesn't yell. But one day, that boy is going to change everything. Maybe not with noise, but with truth. I read that sentence 5 times. I don't know why, but it sparked something in me. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about fighting louder. It was about standing still when they tried to push me over. About holding on to truth when everything around me was built on performance and pride. So I started rebuilding. Quietly. The house became my project. My sanctuary. I replaced the front door myself. Learned how to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen. I even painted the back room, the one where Nana used to read, with a soft teal she would have loved. I couldn't afford big renovations, but it didn't matter. Every change I made felt like claiming a piece of her memory, solidifying my right to be there. I got back into editing too. Took on small gigs at first, online publications, indie writers. Then a friend of mine introduced me to a local nonprofit that needed someone to help produce their newsletter. It paid modestly, but it was consistent. It gave me structure. And better yet, purpose. I also started documenting the lawsuit. Not publicly, not yet, but I kept everything. Every letter, every voicemail, every inconsistency in their claims. I created a timeline of their visits, or lack thereof, during Nana's final months. I gathered witness statements, nurses from the care facility, neighbors who'd seen me there every weekend. I even found photos Nana had taken of us in the garden, dated and time-stamped, long after they claimed she was too confused to make decisions. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about protecting her legacy, her choice. And slowly, the tide began to turn. One morning, I woke up to an email from Raymond. Their side requested mediation. Translation? They were getting nervous. Turns out, dragging out a lawsuit was costing them more than they'd anticipated. Especially since their original argument, Nana's supposed mental decline, was starting to crumble under the weight of documented evidence. But I wasn't in a rush anymore. I didn't want to settle. I wanted them to feel it, to sit in the consequences of what they'd done. And while all this was happening, something else changed too. Me. I wasn't the same quiet kid who apologized for taking up space. I wasn't the one who stepped back at funerals or let my name be dragged through the mud just to keep the peace. I was finding my voice. Not loud, not aggressive, but firm. I reconnected with a few old friends, started going on walks again, even joined a local book club, something Nana always encouraged, but I never had the confidence for. I was still quiet, still observant. But now, I wasn't afraid of being seen. And the house. It blossomed. I brought the hydrangeas back, got some herbs growing in the kitchen window, framed a few of Nana's letters, and hung them in the hallway. Every room told a story, not just of her, but of us. And that, I realized, was something they'd never understand. They thought legacy was about property, about splitting assets like slices of pie. But to me, her legacy was in the way she listened, the way she saw me when no one else bothered to look. And now, that was mine to protect. But just when I thought things were finally starting to settle, something happened that I never saw coming. Something so personal, so violating, that it brought everything crashing back down. And it forced me to make a choice. Fight fire with fire, or finally burn the bridge down myself. The letter came in a manila envelope, no return address. I found it wedged into the mailbox one crisp morning in early March, a week after the mediation had been proposed. At first, I assumed it was just more legal correspondence, another round of half-hearted threats wrapped in formal language. I was used to those by now, but the handwriting on the front wasn't typed. It was scrawled, all capital letters. Messy, slanted, and inside wasn't a document from a lawyer. It was a photocopy of my grandmother's medical records. My stomach dropped. Someone, I didn't know who yet, had sent me records from the hospital with certain sections highlighted in yellow. The parts they clearly thought would make me question everything. Her prescriptions, her memory assessments. One doctor's note that vaguely mentioned occasional signs of confusion when under stress. And attached to the records was a single sentence written on a yellow sticky note. She wasn't in her right mind. You know it. No signature. No indication of who sent it. But I didn't need to guess. My family had crossed a lot of lines before. The insults. The accusations. The lawsuit. But this was something else. This was calculated. This was underhanded. And worst of all, it was done to scare me. They were trying to rattle me, make me doubt what I knew was true. And for a split second, it worked. I sat on the couch for over an hour, holding the packet in my lap, staring at it without moving. That tiny voice came creeping back, the one they'd spent years nurturing in me without ever saying it aloud. What if they're right? What if she made a mistake? What if you didn't deserve this house after all? But then I looked up. On the wall above the fireplace was a framed photo of me and Nana. It had been taken the summer before she passed. I was holding a mug of tea, she was squinting against the sun, and we were both laughing, truly laughing. The date was scribbled on the back. It was a week after the doctor had written his vague note. She hadn't been confused that day. She'd been sharp, present, warm. That wasn't the mind of a woman being manipulated. That was Evelyn Martin, clear-eyed and deliberate. And that's when I knew. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. But not the kind they expected. No yelling. No screaming matches. No shouting across mediation tables. I was going to dismantle them quietly, strategically, piece by piece. Because Nana hadn't raised a fighter. She'd raised a listener. And I had listened. For years. I started with the records. I took the entire packet, the medical forms, the sticky note, and brought them straight to Raymond, Nana's lawyer. He flipped through them with a careful eye, then whistled low under his breath. This wasn't filed through court, he said, tapping the envelope. which means they're trying to rattle you informally before the mediation date. Can we use this? I asked. He nodded slowly. Oh, we can do more than that. If they leaked confidential records, it's a breach of privacy. We can report it. But I told him not yet. I wasn't ready to strike. I was still gathering ammo. I started researching, not just my rights, but theirs. My mother, Mark, and Dean were far from clean. Over the years, I'd heard enough fragments of conversation, half-whispered rumors at holiday dinners, and passive-aggressive barbs to suspect there were skeletons. I just needed to find the closet doors. That's when I made a call I'd been avoiding. To someone who knew all their worst habits, from inside the circle. My cousin Ellie. Ellie was Mark's daughter, 2 years younger than me. We weren't especially close growing up. She was always the pretty, polished, people-pleasing type. But I remembered her once crying on the phone to Nana after Mark cut off her college fund because she wasn't performing well enough in school. And I remembered Nana helping her quietly, behind everyone's back. She'd always been protective of Ellie, even when the rest of the family dismissed her as weak or dramatic. So I called. She didn't pick up right away, but an hour later, she texted. Didn't expect to hear from you. You okay? I texted back. Not really, but I think you're one of the only people who'd understand. She agreed to meet me at a diner halfway between our cities. We sat in a booth, ordered greasy hash browns and burnt coffee, and talked for almost 2 hours. And what she told me, it was everything I needed. Turns out, Mark had been skimming from one of the family trusts for years, money originally set aside for Nana's long-term care, which she'd later refused when she decided to live modestly. Instead of returning the funds to the estate, Mark had quietly redirected them into his failing startup. The paper trail was messy, but Ellie had access to some of the bank emails from when she was helping him with documents years ago. Dean, meanwhile, had quietly filed for bankruptcy twice, once under his name, once using a shell LLC. That alone wouldn't be a bombshell, except that he'd been claiming to the court during the lawsuit that he was financially stable, in hopes of arguing for equitable property distribution. And my mother? She wasn't quite as reckless with money, but she was manipulative. Ellie told me about emails and texts she'd seen, messages where my mother openly mocked Nana's old woman guilt complex, bragged about how easy it was to get her to sign checks, and even described me, once, as the family ghost, harmless, but easily manipulated. Those were her exact words. I sat in stunned silence as Ellie scrolled through her old files and screenshots, pulling up email after email. And then, just before we left, she slid her phone across the table. This one, she said, is the worst. It was a voice memo, one I'd never heard. My mom and Mark, at some event, talking casually. And in the background, I could hear my name. Mark's voice. So, we just pushed the he manipulated her angle, right? That's what the lawyer said. Mom's voice. Obviously, Noah won't fight it. He never fights. He'll cave the second it gets tense. They laughed. I stared at the phone. My hands were cold. Ellie put it away quietly. I'm not proud of this, but if it helps you, it's yours. It did help. It changed everything. With Raymond's help, I began documenting every bit of evidence. The voice memo, the leaked medical files, the financial inconsistencies. I built a binder, thick, tabbed, dated, not to present in court just yet, but to hold, to wait, because mediation was in 2 weeks. And I didn't want to win quietly. I wanted them to see the trap closing around them. Slowly. In the meantime, I took Ellie's advice on something else. Start telling your story, she'd said. The real one, before they twist it. So I began writing. Not for a blog, not for social media, but for myself. A journal, a record. Every memory of Nana. Every injustice I'd endured from them growing up. Every kind word she ever said. Every tear I never let fall. I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote until the paper was damp. And when I finished, I printed out the most powerful pages, the ones that made me feel something, and I placed them in the back of the evidence binder. Because revenge wasn't just about proving they were wrong. It was about reminding myself I was right. The day of mediation came with gray skies and the scent of rain. I arrived early. Raymond and I took a seat in the bland conference room, sipping weak coffee. Across from us, 3 seats sat empty. 10 minutes later, they arrived. My mother, Mark, Dean, dressed to impress, confident, smiling. They didn't know what was coming. They thought this was the beginning of the end. They had no idea it was the end of the beginning. And when I opened the binder, When I slid the first piece of evidence across the table, when their smug faces began to change, I knew the setup was complete, and the fall was about to begin. They weren't expecting the binder. My mother, Mark, and Dean walked into that mediation room like they'd already won, like they were showing up to collect their victory in cash. My mother gave me that same forced smile she'd worn at Nana's funeral, the one that said I'm being watched, so I'll pretend you matter. Mark nodded like a man greeting a waiter. Dean didn't even acknowledge me, just straightened his cuffs, muttered something to their lawyer, and sat. They didn't see the storm waiting for them on the table. Raymond slid the binder into the center with the smooth, practiced grace of a man who'd been waiting to deliver a checkmate for weeks. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "my client has some evidence he'd like to present." Their lawyer, a smug, well-coiffed guy named Greg, frowned. We were under the impression this meeting was to discuss a settlement, not open discovery. Raymond gave him a polite smile. "You were under the wrong impression." I didn't say a word. I just opened the binder. First tab, the voice memo. Raymond hit play on the little speaker he'd brought. The recording filled the room. Mark's voice, unmistakable. "So, we just pushed the he manipulated her angle, right?" That's what the lawyer said. Then my mother. "Obviously. Noah won't fight it. He never fights. He'll cave the second it gets tense." The laughter that followed used to haunt me. Not anymore. Silence. Thick, choked, embarrassing silence. Greg's mouth actually dropped open. Dean shifted in his seat. Mark looked like someone had dropped ice cubes down the back of his shirt. And my mother, she blinked, then blinked again, like she was trying to physically delete what she'd just heard. Raymond cleared his throat. "That's Exhibit A. Shall we move to B?" They didn't object. Next came the hospital records, the ones they'd mailed anonymously to rattle me. Raymond flipped to the page with the sticky note, slid it across the table. This was not obtained through legal channels. In fact, it's a serious breach of patient confidentiality. And we have reason to believe one of the plaintiffs procured this via unauthorized access. Greg tried to recover. "This doesn't prove anything." "We'll let the court decide that," Raymond said. Calm. Firm. I didn't know lawyers could sound like teachers giving their most disappointing student a warning. Then came the bankruptcy records. Dean's face went white when the Shell LLC name was spoken aloud. Raymond was polite, surgical. "Your client failed to disclose these during the financial disclosure phase, which, I believe, qualifies as perjury in a civil case, yes?" Dean opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched his knuckles go pale as he gripped the edge of the chair. Next up, Mark's startup funding. Ellie had delivered the receipts, emails between Mark and an associate where he bragged about repurposing the family care funds. There was even a line where he joked, "I'll just say Nana didn't need it anymore. Noah won't even notice. Kid's basically a ghost." I watched his face as he read that line. It was the first time in my life I'd seen Mark without that arrogant glint in his eye. For a moment, he looked like a little boy who got caught stealing cookies and suddenly realized the jar was wired with an alarm system. Finally, Raymond handed over printed pages, excerpts from my journal. My voice, my memories, the pieces of Nana they couldn't erase. Greg tried to interrupt, claiming it was irrelevant, but Raymond just raised a hand. It establishes motive, character, and, most importantly, truth. Then he turned to me. "Noah, would you like to speak?" I stood up slowly. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Control. "I didn't want this," I said, voice quiet but steady. "I didn't ask for the house. I didn't ask for the ring. I didn't ask for the love she gave me. But I never turned it away. And maybe that's what this is really about." I looked at each of them. My mother, who once told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously. Mark, who used to say I had a forgettable presence. Dean, who never remembered my birthday once in 27 years. She loved me. Not because I earned it. Not because I asked for it. But because I showed up. I listened. I cared. My mother scoffed, barely audible. "And you?" I said, turning to them fully. "You couldn't stand that. Because you thought love was currency. Something you had to perform for. Something you had to take." I paused, letting it hang there. Maybe you were right. Maybe love is currency. And she spent it on me. Raymond nodded. "I believe we're done here." Greg's face was flushed. "Are you really not interested in settling?" Raymond smiled. "You're welcome to make an offer. But be warned. The number goes up every time you insult my client's integrity." They dropped the lawsuit within a week. No public apology, of course. That would have required something like humility. But the papers came through, settlement withdrawn, no further claims to the property, full ownership retained by me. Their silence was their surrender. And their silence was loud. Word got around the family pretty quickly, not because I told anyone, but because they did. Quietly, behind closed doors. Little murmurs and revisions of the story. Suddenly, I wasn't the manipulative grandson. I was the one Evelyn always liked, the one who stayed by her side, the one she trusted. Isn't it funny how quickly people rewrite history when they lose? Dean moved out of state not long after. His finances were worse than anyone realized. Mark's startup collapsed within the year. Last I heard, he was working for someone else, a guy who used to be his intern. My mother? She tried to pretend like it never happened. Reached out once around Christmas, left a voicemail asking if I wanted to start fresh. I didn't return the call. And Ellie? We stayed close. I invited her to the house that spring, for tea, just like Nana used to make. We sat on the porch, surrounded by new flowers I'd planted, and talked about everything. She'd started therapy, was considering going back to school. For the first time, she said, she felt like she could breathe. This house, she said, sipping from a cracked old mug. It's not just a house, you know. I nodded. I do. It was legacy, and justice, and memory. It was every quiet summer afternoon, every handwritten letter, every moment I thought I didn't matter, rewritten, rebuilt, reclaimed. I kept the ring in a box on the mantel, not because I needed to show it off, but because it reminded me that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the loudest truths. Nana was right. Listening is a lost art. But I never stopped listening.